All right, the mystery of the ages. And so we're moving into a new dispensation, which is generally referred to as the dispensation of conscience. And of course, this extends from the fall to the flood. Lasted for approximately 1,656 years. And that's really the only thing that mankind had during that particular time period to guide him and direct him and differentiate for him between right and wrong was his conscience. And actually, you learn more about the conscience of mankind in the book of Romans than you do in the book of Genesis, where it was actually in place and operational. Paul gives us some pretty detailed information about the conscience in Romans 1, 2, and 3, which is pretty informative. So, under salvation on your outline, point 1, I'm just going to read this paragraph because it's pretty informative and it's got a lot of information in it. In the antediluvian dispensation, mankind was treated as a whole. By a whole, we mean there was no such thing as nations. There was no such thing as a Jew or a Gentile. There were 3 groups of people later, but at this time, just a group of people, that's all. And so in Acts chapter 17, verse 30, this particular time is called the times of ignorance, and it's contrasted with the times that are now. And we are told that in this dispensation, and I don't know if you ever read this verse and really thought about it, but over in Acts 17 it says God winked at their ignorance. He winked. In other words, he allowed some things to take place, understanding full well that the only lighthouse or compass for moral behavior they had was their conscience. And sadly, a conscience may produce fear and remorse, but it will not keep men from doing wrong. The conscience in itself has no power. Animals don't have a conscience. Now, everyone is born with a conscience, but the problem is, oftentimes to compounded misbehavior, conscience is slowly, as Paul said, seared over. In other words, it becomes very calloused, and it becomes very hard and difficult to penetrate. But back in that dispensation, from the fall to the flood, this was the standard by which men accused or else excused themselves. In other words, they accused other people based on their own conscience, or they excused their own behavior. You see, and Paul very clearly states that. So the Sinaitic law, the 10 Commandments, the law, wasn't given until after the Exodus. It wasn't given until after they crossed the Red Sea. It wasn't given until Moses received it by the hand of God up on Mount Sinai. And so there was no legal, now let me emphasize that, there was no legal standard for sin until the law came about, until the law was given. The only thing that was there was the conscience. Now that's not to minimize the conscience, because the conscience can be and has often been utilized as a powerful tool, not necessarily for conviction, but for information. You know, it gives people the information and the ability to discern between right and wrong. So back in those days, it was a little different in the respect that, number one, God was near to mankind in such a way that we may not necessarily experience today, nor do we need to, because we have His Word. But His voice was heard as a voice of rebuke to Cain, in communion with Enoch in Genesis 5, or in counsel with Noah. And so God literally spoke to people. I get nervous when people say today, well, God spoke to me. Yeah. Really? Really? Well, He speaks to me every day. Yeah. Right here, you know. In fact, He's got mountains of information here that I need, and as we all do. So In that dispensation, people, generally speaking, ignored the voice of God, ignored their conscience, and the result was the society as a whole became so vile and so corrupt and so sinful that ultimately God said the only solution is a flood. And so the flood came. And as we well know, took out the entire population of the world with the exception of Noah and his family. So the principles which govern God's administration of those times of ignorance would not necessarily be appropriate in the days of Moses. Why? Because when God revealed his will through the law. So we must then distinguish these two dispensations, the law versus conscience, one being without the law and the other being under the law. So therefore it would affect the basis of judgment in these dispensations. This distinction is brought out clearly in Romans 2 and verse 12 when it says, "For as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law. As many have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law." Now, not only is that true in days gone by, now let me say this, even though we're talking about dispensations in the past, those rules still apply today to people without the law. The precedent was set in motion many, many generations ago, which answers, as you delve into Romans 1 and 2, the age-old question that people love to ask, thinking that they're going to trip up the innocent, ignorant Christian, you see. Well, what about those people that have never heard your gospel, the Aborigines in the dark end of Africa or Australia or something? What about them? Question number one, do they have a conscience? They do. And you know they do because every culture in the world has some system of laws. Every culture in the world has do's and don'ts. And they have consequences for the don'ts. You see, there isn't a culture that has ever survived that was just totally freelancing, free willy-nilly, do whatever you want to do without some kind of consequences in place. That in itself is evidence of a conscience. One question that I love to ask the evolutionist is, along the trail of evolution, when first one-celled amoeba crawled out on the beach and divided himself into two cells and on it went until finally your great-great-granddaddy was a monkey. Where along that trail did man develop a conscience? Y'all have seen the charts of the Neanderthals and how they start and they come on up through and finally they're walking on two legs and all that stuff. And the caveman became very sophisticated and now he lives in San Bernardino. And, you've seen all that stuff, Did you live in San Bernardino? So, where can you pinpoint on that chart where man finally got a conscience? And it suggests that there is no such thing as lunacy. Because even the most rank liberal has to understand that there's a conscience, because what else can he put in reason to his particular aspirations for society? If it's not his conscience, even though in our perspective his conscience may be bent and twisted, you see, what is socialism theoretically? It's the conscience of mankind desiring the best for everybody. Now it's a faulty premise, but that's allegedly the reasoning behind it, you see. So to deny that there is such a conscience that won't fly with anybody that's got half a brain, you see. All right, so we have the conscience. Man is under the conscience. So we have Joe Aborigine out here somewhere, and Susie Heathen out there and all that other stuff, you see. Well, they have a conscience. And God says if they have no exposure to the word of truth, then they will be judged just like all those people were for 1,600 plus years. Judged by their conscience. How did they respond to it, you see? Et cetera, et cetera. Now, God gives us more details about that in the book of Romans. And then Paul says those that are judged by the law or those that are judged without the law. And of course the other response is, well, what about people that have never heard about the Ten Commandments, never heard about the law of God? Same thing, okay. You're either judged by the law or without the law, but judgment still remains a reality. All right, so having said that, while there was no written law in the dispensation before the flood, there was an unwritten law. And Paul makes that very clear. He says, when the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature the things contained in the law, they show that they have a law written in their hearts. For not the hearers of the law are justified before God, but the doers or those who keep it. So Paul again makes the thing abundantly clear that there are people that have an unwritten law, and the kinds of people we just discussed momentarily or a little bit ago. Now it should also be noted that evidently this information come perhaps, and certainly it did in some cases, by direct information from God, but perhaps otherwise just conscience. It should be noted that a blood sacrifice became evident early in this dispensation. All right, now what did God clothe Adam and Eve with? He clothed them with skins of animals. Consequently, innocent blood was shed so that they might be clothed and hide their nakedness, which was a demonstration of their disobedience and their sin. And that's not all. Abel knew about a blood sacrifice, did he not? Noah knew about a blood sacrifice. And God communicated with mankind and made messages of obedience pretty clear back in those days. Cain knew that he was violating God's commandment, and he said, well, I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. Well, Cain is an absolute wonderful picture of today's religious person. I have my religion. I tell you how many times I've heard that. Well, I have my religion. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about religion. What I'm talking about is, do you have salvation? You know, can your religion guarantee you salvation? Religion really isn't worth a whole lot, but Jesus is worth everything. He came to provide salvation. Now, during this particular time, and here's where I want to concentrate for perhaps the remainder of this lesson. And we're going to stick with the notes a little longer, and then we're going to go freelancing. You'll need to have your pencil ready, because I'll give you some scriptures that are not in your notes. But go to Genesis 6 with me. Now, having said what we've said about the dispensation of conscience and how man is going to be judged by his conscience and the salvation that was provided during that dispensation of conscience, we must go back in our mind's eye momentarily to remember what's God's original plan. Lesson number 1, do you remember what God's original plan was? To populate the heavens and the earth. That's God's plan. All right, now, we noticed in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, and we discerned that that was a perfect creation. And verse 2, as a result of some cataclysmic, chaotic kind of situation that took place, which caused the earth to plummet and to fall, and any inhabitants that it had on it. And of course, the God of this world was the God of this world then as he is now, you see. And so he fell as recorded in Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah chapter 14. All right, so from that point forward, we have a recreation. But God's plan is still in effect. God has a plan to populate the heavens and the earth, according to Isaiah 45. Now, having said that, the devil knows that. He's acutely aware of that. Because initially that was the creation, this earth, and the atmospheric conditions around this earth. That was his domain given by God. God said, okay, I'm going to institute you as the king of this domain. Well, after his fall, God appointed another king, King Adam. And so Adam was placed in a garden, and Adam was given a commission prior to the fall. Before he ever sinned, the commission was, be fruitful and replenish the face of the earth. So you see what Satan saw in that? He saw the immediate threat. The immediate threat was Adam and his progeny were going to be the inhabitants to fulfill God's original plan. Populate the heavens and the earth. So the God of this world, Satan, immediately went on the attack. And so he said, I want my kingdom back. Now, how many stories in literature over 4,000 or 5,000 years have been written about a deposed king who is fighting to get his kingdom back? It's a continuing theme that never leaves humanity. It's always there, get my kingdom back, get my kingdom back. Well, the reason why is the whole idea is predicated on a biblical theme. And so Satan said, I'm going to get my kingdom back. And so the first thing that he did was he approached Eve with the temptation in the garden. And the result of that we've already discovered is mankind fell, and they fell from this position of innocence, the dispensation of innocence, into a dispensation of conscience, because now they violated the commandment of God, and now they're living in a depraved, sinful condition that has a curse attached to it. But that's not the only move of Satan. He said, okay, maybe I've got them under control now. Maybe now that the curse has landed on them, that might curtail God utilizing them to populate the heavens and the earth. So Satan comes up with plan B, Genesis chapter 6. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair. And they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, and the same became mighty men which are of old, men of renown. All right, so what do we have here? Well, the sons of God in the Old Testament are not the same as the sons of God in the New Testament. The phrase the sons of God in the Old Testament is utilized 5 times. Twice in the book of Genesis and 3 times in the book of Job. The sons of God are fallen angelic creatures. They are emissaries and disciples of Satan. And as you study these verses carefully, that becomes pretty self-evident. A son of God is a created being. Now wait a minute. Adam is also called a son of God. In Luke, you see, we studied that last time, I think. But all of his offspring are not called a son of God. They're called the sons of Adam. And the reason for that is Adam is now creating offspring that is no longer a created being by God. It's a created being of Adam. And it's a depraved created being. And so Satan says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to send some of my imps out there, and they're going to come to the earth, and they're going to procreate with earth women. All right. Now, do you know that that is one of the basic benchmarks of Greek mythology? If you study Greek mythology, most of their gods are a hybrid creature of the gods, quote, wherever they are, and humanity. Where did they ever come up with that notion in the first place? Where did they ever come up with such an idea, you know? Well, they had to get it out of the Word of God. All right. Now, I don't know if you ever watch the History Channel or not, but they're just constantly running out stuff about aliens from, you know, in ancient days, from outer space and all that. And in fact, I got a DVD of one of their deals that I may run out here for you soon to help embellish this a little bit, because the world that you know, that they continue to explore some of these monumental things of creation that cannot be humanly explained. A classic example is the Great Pyramid of Cheops and other pyramids. You know, and scientists and mathematicians and builders have studied that thing, and they say, we had no clue how they did it. How did they do that? And then they get to looking around and saying, well, where did they get these stones? I mean, some of the stones in that pyramid are as big as this room. And how did they carve them so precisely? So precisely that you can't get a knife blade between them. How did they do that? And then they look around for stone supplies and quarries, and they find out that the closest ones are hundreds of miles away. Well, how did they move them? How did they get them from way down yonder in Africa all the way up to Egypt? How did they do that? And how did they get them elevated up into place? You know, so these are all questions that have mesmerized the thinking of people that pursue that kind of thing, archaeologists and all the rest of them, for several hundred years. How did they do it? Well, more and more and more, even the History Channel, even science is relying more and more on the theory that this knowledge and information and capability to do those things was transmitted to them by people from outer space. And it's not just Egypt, it's the Mayas and the Aztecs, and they go all over the world coming up with this stuff and saying, oh boy, how did they do this and how did they do that? And it's pretty fascinating, really. I'll tell you how they did it. Exactly like Genesis 6 says they did it. What they produced was a hybrid race of advanced knowledge and revelation and skill in these kind of areas that produced those things. You know, the Pyramid of Cheops is, I've been there. I've been inside of it. It's an amazing structure. It really is. But they speculate, based on remnants they have found, that the whole face of that thing was covered with alabaster. But it's gone. It's like it was washed away. Washed away in a giant flood, you see. All right, so anyway, these sons of God show up, and of course the motive, the satanic motive behind commissioning these sons of God, angelic creatures, to come to earth and co-inhabit with earth women to produce a superior race. Why is it that some people have always been fascinated with the superior race? Like Hitler. And of course he was so demonic that the superior race that he wasn't even part, I mean, he thought the, tall, blue-eyed, blonde-haired people were the superior race. And he didn't look like that at all. But the people that he thought were the enemy are actually the superior race. The Jews. You know, they're, as far as the race and intelligence and capabilities and scientific invention and all the rest of it. He's attacking that. Now, but this crowd right here, between this hybrid bunch right here, let me see, in the cow world we call them F1s, right? Yeah. And so we got a bunch of F1s running around here. And the satanic motive or thought is, I will replace God's creatures, as it were, humankind, with my own kind, and we will continue to fulfill the original plan of populating the heavens and the earth. But this particular thing that we're reading about in Genesis chapter 6 is not without precedent. And this is where it gets real interesting. Hang on to your saddle horn. The cutting horse is about to turn right. I want you to go to 1 John chapter 3. 1 John chapter 3, verse 12. Not as Cain, who was of that wicked one, and slew his brother. And wherefore slew he him? Because his own works were evil, and his brother's righteous. Now here's an interesting phrase that has to capture our attention and deserves a little exploration. Not as Cain, who was of that wicked one. Well, what possibility is that surrendering? He was of the wicked one. All right, let's go to John chapter 8. Not 1 John, but the Gospel of John. In John chapter 8, Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees. He said, ye are of your father, the devil. And the lust of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. Now I know that I understand that generally speaking, when we read this, ye are of your father the devil, we believe that Jesus is utilizing some kind of a metaphoric kind of language, you see. And he's identifying them, at least spiritually, with the devil. And there's nothing wrong with that interpretation. That could be considered to be absolutely correct. However, is there the remotest suggestion here that the devil is capable of fatherhood? He didn't just say, ye are of the devil. He said, ye are of your father, the devil. Interesting. Now, let's go to Genesis in chapter 4. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain and said, I've gotten a man from the Lord. I wonder why she felt compelled to make that declaration. I've gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. All right, the indication is that Cain and Abel were twins. All right, that's interesting. They were twins. But wait, is there something else we need to observe? 2 Corinthians 11. Ever since God said what he did in Genesis 3:15 about the seed of the woman, which we know ultimately is Jesus Christ, the devil has done everything he can to pollute human seed. Because it's within the boundaries of human seed that God initially intended to populate the heavens and the earth. Satan knows if he can pollute it sufficiently, it may destroy itself, just like it almost did in the flood. It came very close. All right, now in 2 Corinthians and chapter 11 and verse 1. Would to God you could bear with me a little in my folly, and indeed bear with me. For I am jealous over you with godly jealousy. For I have espoused you to one husband. All right, now he's talking to the Corinthians, and he says, I'm jealous over you, and I've espoused you to one husband, and of course that husband would be Christ, spiritually speaking. Now, but then he dives into a very interesting litany here, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. But I fear, lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your minds should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. Well, how did the serpent beguile Eve? Well, he tempted her to partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which gave her a conscience and gave her the ability, you see, to understand the difference between right and wrong. But why would God use the serpent beguiled Eve in the same context as a chaste virgin? Doesn't that strike you a bit odd? You know, what's the Lord telling us here? Why would the devil beguiling Eve be mentioned in this same context? All right, now, but people say, yeah, but Satan appeared to Eve as a snake. No, you're observing mismanufactured artistic impressions. No, he didn't become a snake until after the curse. All right, now look down here. Let's see how he must have appeared. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 14. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. All right, now let's go back to Cain and Abel, who by all appearances were twins. But it says Eve conceived, and then she bare Cain and Abel. You know, in fact, I just read an article very recently, within the last month, about a pair of twins that were born, conceived of two different fathers, as much as a week apart. Science says, not only is it possible, it happens. It happens. Conceived of two different fathers, as much as a week apart, and you have twins. Far out. What's going on back there? You know, the Catholic Church has long maintained that the original sin is adultery. Now, I don't agree with that. The original sin is disobeying God. But where did they ever come up with that idea? Where did they ever come up with that notion? Again, you have to ask yourself that question. So, Satan has done everything that he possibly could, not only personally to corrupt human seed, but all those that have followed him in the name of the sons of God have done the same, all in an effort for Satan to reclaim his kingdom. Satan knew that if society became corrupt enough, God would be obligated, because of his righteousness and his holiness, to destroy that society. And that's exactly what took place. Amazingly, that is exactly what took place. So, you say, well, do you teach this as absolute doctrine? No, I teach this as absolute possibility. And I don't know what else to do with these scriptures we just looked at. I don't know what else to do with it except say, well, there you go. It's just another satanic effort. And so it leads us to the question, why is modern society and ancient society, as long as man has been on the earth, so absolutely infatuated with sex? Why? You say, well, it's just hormones. Well, it's more than that. It's more than that. There's something there that's going on, you see. It's more than that. So, in point 3 on your outline, the characteristics of the antediluvian dispensation as outlined by the late Dr. A.T. Pearson were, and he said this, and he said it very appropriately, first an advance in fullness and clearness of revelation, then gradual spirit declension, then conformity to the world, ending with amalgamation with the world, then a gigantic civilization, brilliant but godless, then parallel development of evil and good, then an apostasy, and finally a catastrophe. Now wait a minute. Didn't Jesus say concerning the last days, as in the days of Noah? Now what we have just been reading about are just previous to the days of Noah. You see, so in Genesis chapter 6, we start with the sons of God came into the daughters of men. And by the time we get through the chapter, we're introduced to Noah, introduced to the flood and the whole deal, you see. So what took place then is repeating itself now. History recycles itself, does it not? And it just continues to go round and round and round. When we read about the sons of God in Genesis 6, we understand and realize that, hey, wait a minute. Satan was successful in his own efforts in regards to Eve. So he said, I got a lot of helpers out there that can duplicate this whole operation. You remember the old story, and I guess it was a movie and a book, Rosemary's Baby? What's Rosemary's Baby all about? A woman had the devil's baby. Is that possible? Well, he transforms himself into an angel of light. In other words, he has transforming capabilities. He can take on a multitude of appearances. You know, people think of the devil, well, he's just some little green snake rolling around in an apple tree somewhere. Boy, you got that dead wrong. You couldn't be any more wrong. In one occasion, he's a 7-headed dragon about half as big as the universe. I mean, you get over in the book of Revelation. So, the reason for pointing this out is, in the next dispensation, the next lesson, you know what we're going to study? We're going to study, and maybe it's a sub-dispensation, I don't know, you can call it what you will. But before we get actually into the full dispensation of the law, we're going to break it down from the flood till Sinai and call it the dispensation of human government. All right, and so every dispensation you can see the failures in that dispensation. Conscience failed. That's not to say that conscience is a failure. It can be a success if it be followed. But as a dispensation, it was a failure. The next failure, the failure of human government. God gives mankind, even though he hadn't given them the law yet, he gives them certain guidelines that we'll read about. And that too is a failure. And you know what we're going to see? We're going to see that Satan is still on the job. And so King Adam loses his kingdom. And so after the flood, God awards the same kingdom to Noah. We'll see almost the identical verbiage that he gave to Adam. Now he gives to Noah. He says, now you be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. King Noah. And what does Noah do? Blows it. The first thing he does, he plants a vineyard and mixes a brew. You know, and gets fallen down drunk, you know. And that just leads, one sin leads to the next one, you see. And Noah, he loses the very kingdom that God awarded him. And so by default, the kingdom keeps reverting back to the one who it was initially given. Satan. So to this day, he's still declared to be the God of this world. Thankfully, we've read the last chapter of the book. We know it's not always going to be that way, because the rightful king is going to return. And so in the meantime, you and I are responsible to be a bunch of little Robin Hoods. Tormenting King John.